Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to another Leaders Village webinar. We're glad that you're joining in to the adventure of finding our way together. Today's conversation, I believe, is going to be extremely significant. But I think what's most interesting from my perspective is that it recognizes one of the greatest failures in my ministry life. And so I'm not necessarily proud about my contribution to what we're going to talk about today, but I'm grateful for the grace that God has shown in my life, in our community. And I hope by sharing this, you can experience more of His grace in your life and your community as well. So what I'm going to do as quickly as possible is hand this over to the real expert, who isn't me, a woman that God kind of placed in my path years ago by the name of Ellen Duffield. Ellen, welcome to our Leaders Village webinar.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's great to be here.
For those of us across the country who are tracking with this conversation, we want to get to know you a little bit better before we dive into the real subject matter. So can you just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and the kind of things that we need to know to connect with your heart and just track with you a little bit better?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So first of all, again, great to be here. And then also excited to be talking about this really important topic. So as you mentioned, Jeff, my name's Ellen, and I lived in Ontario for many years, which is, of course, where we met. And I'm married and my husband and I have 2 children, and we have 6 little grandchildren. So that's a really important part of our lives. I've also had the privilege of being involved in leadership development for a number of years, and have worked in a variety of different settings, both as a leader and training leaders. So that's a piece that's really important to me as well.
People who are experiencing this realize that this is a remote conversation. Do you want to just let us in on where you are right now, knowing you're not in Niagara, and why you're there, what you're doing these days?
Yeah, thank you. So I live in Saskatchewan. I started just a month or so ago working at Briarcrest Seminary at the Paul E. Magnus Center for Leadership Studies. And of course, I did try to come to Ontario so that we could be together, but blizzards and illness and different things prevented that. So it's great to be able to connect this way.
Someone has wanted us to not have this conversation, is what I've been telling myself. So I think it's going to be extra special. We're here to talk about female leadership empowerment. And I guess just to enter into this a little bit, Ellen, where did this passion emerge and for you, especially from like an academic, theological, scholarly perspective?
Yeah. So when you asked that question, Jeff, it moved immediately to kind of like a personal story for me, because this was not an area that I can say that I chose or ever envisioned being involved in, probably just the opposite. It was more something that grew out of a season where I felt what I now know was a time of lament. At the time, it just felt like a time of wrestling with some of the stories that I was hearing from women, many of whom had been really hurt by relationships from their childhood or by relationships when they were teenagers. And it kind of took me into this season of trying to figure out, hey, what's going on in the world of humanity and what's going on in the world, in the relationships of men and women. And I'm just wired to try and understand something. And so that led to a season of research. And I had the privilege of being able to travel a fair bit. I was teaching in many parts of the world at the time. And anytime I would travel, I would do some little focus groups, just very informal focus groups. And then I was reading and I was gathering all this data. And I had this piles and piles of data that I didn't know how to make sense of. And so at the age of 50, I actually went back to school in order to try and make some sense of that. And that was really an act of, I'm going to call it obedience. I know that sounds, a bit pious, but it really was an act of obedience at that point in my life, because I really felt that God was inviting me to join Him in the journey of reconciliation and what it means for men and women to partner together, what it means for people from various backgrounds to partner together, what that looks like, what that could look like, and especially in the church.
Knowing that you were on that journey for a number of years before we met, what was the kind of precipitating incident, or like, how did you get connected with me and with Southridge?
Yeah, so this was another interesting story where I had gone to a conference that I didn't want to go to. Someone who was working at Southridge at the time had gone to a conference that she didn't particularly want to go to. Her supervisor connected her to me, which she didn't particularly want to do. And we met for lunch, and then we ended up having this amazing conversation. This, of course, was Sophia Adama, and she was a really early advocate for women and girls at Southridge. And then a year passed, and I barely even heard from her during that time. And then she reached out again and said, hey, we're having these conversations at Southridge. Jeff would like to meet you. And we met at the little restaurant across the road from the church. And, the rest is history, so to speak.
The Chris Fowler connection of you and Sophia Adama started this whole mess. It's great. It was one of those divine appointments that certainly, personally, I'm grateful for even to this day. Ellen, I want to get kind of right into some of your research. But before we do, let's talk about a little bit of the background of Southridge that you kind of came into, knowing that for me, having had already led in our church for a number of years, I didn't bring a complementarian theological view to leadership in the church. I started, people who aren't familiar, I pastored the church that I have grown up in since I was a 10-year-old kid, and was part of a generational transfer in my mid-20s, where the church leadership at the time handed the kind of keys of leadership over to the kids who'd grown up in the church. And at the time, those kids predominantly were boys, were young men. And that for me was, I would say, just tradition, or maybe the expectation at the time. But I guess two things from my perspective. Number one, I held an egalitarian view on leadership. And more importantly, I'd grown up in an environment that believed men and women could lead. I'm part of a family of 3 kids. My younger brother pastored with me for 16 years and now runs his own business. And my sister runs a Bible school in Japan. So when it came to like growing up with leaders and even growing up with spiritual leaders, I've always lived in the world where men and women can lead, let alone lead together. But now fast forward a few years, and what started in my church leadership experience as this cute little band of brothers, by the time I met you, what had driven us to start to stare this in the face was that cute little band of brothers was now being referred to as an impenetrable boys club. And I was starting to hear that, and knowing that our intent was very different than that impact, we had no idea what was going on. And some of your research kind of hit that question or that challenge or that conviction really remarkably. And one of those kind of pieces of data was the information you provided about the trajectory shift in women's confidence. Can you talk about that for a few moments? Because this was game-changing for people like me.
Yeah, this is a really disturbing piece of data, actually. Someone named Dr. Robin Goodman from New York discovered that a woman's confidence level peaks at age 9. And if that's true, which there is some substantial evidence that suggests that that is true, not in every culture and not for every girl, of course, but if that is true, then of course that raises all kinds of questions about what that's about. And there are both internal factors and external factors that are contributing to that. But what that means is that as a girl grows towards 10 and 11 and 12, her confidence level is actually dropping, so that by the time she's in her teenage years, it's quite low, significantly lower than her male peers statistically. And then again, even through her university education and moving into a career, her confidence level stays low and even continues to drop depending on her circumstances and her personal journey until she's at least in her 40s or 50s. And even then, it doesn't go up for many women. And that's a pretty disturbing piece of information when we think about all these precocious little 8-year-olds that we know and how brave they are, and then knowing that within a very short time, that's most likely going to change for a lot of our girls.
Talking about this, I'd be interested in some of your observations, but I was talking about this again recently with my wife, and we were processing our daughter, Adeline, who now is in grade 9. But when she was younger, there were 2 stories that came to mind. One was when she was younger, and I'd said to her, "Hey, Addie, you have to choose between being pretty or smart." I said, "Which do you want to be?" And she looked at me indignantly and just said, "Dad, I'm the whole package." And I thought, how many girls growing up continue to believe that they can kind of be, or that they are the whole package? And we sort of giggled about that. The one that was far more haunting to me was early on when we'd heard this data from you. I remember Becky and I were talking about this, processing this in our kitchen, and Addie was quite young at the time. And so I said, "Addie, come on up and I want to talk to you." I said, "Repeat after me. I am a smart girl." And she said, "I am a smart girl." I said, "I am a pretty girl." She said, "I am a pretty girl." I said, "I am a strong girl." She says, "I am a strong girl. Feel my muscles." And she said it with such confidence. And I looked over at Becky and tears were flowing down her eyes. Because she said, if you asked me to say those things, I wouldn't be able to say them and mean them. And she was kind of in her 30s at the times. And it just experientially all of a sudden illuminated something that I had never been aware of. This growing kind of disparity between the default of confidence in men and insecurity in women. I remember you telling us the story about women and men coming out of a college exam. A group of men high-fiving because they aced it, and they probably got 70s. And a group of women fretting over how badly they did, and they probably got 90s. Meaning it's not an issue of competence, but it's only an issue of confidence. And just real time in my experience, I started to realize how real and palpable and pervasive that dynamic is. I'm wondering if you wanted to add any anecdotes or even personal experiences to the reality of that data.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the moment that the pin dropped for me, and what started a lot of my research in this direction, as you mentioned, is I was sitting with a group of very articulate, well-educated, beautiful young women in my living room up in Muskoka, where we lived in Ontario. And we were having a conversation about some upcoming event. And I asked one of these young women, who was an athlete, as she was functioning at national levels as an athlete. She was leading a large team in the organization that we were working in. She was very well educated, very beautiful, had a great boyfriend, all of those things. If you were to look at her, you'd be like, there's someone who really has everything. And when I asked her to lead this initiative, she just backed right away, physically and verbally, and said, "Oh, I could never do that. I could never lead." And yet she was holding a leadership position, a very significant leadership position in the organization that we were working in. And I remember being so taken aback by that and thinking, if this young woman and this group of very privileged and very well educated and very articulate women are lacking confidence, what is it like for the rest of us? And that's really what started me along this journey. And exactly like you described with Becky, I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had over the last 30 plus years now with women in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s sometimes, who are saying, if I were to identify one thing that has significantly held me back within my life, and even with stepping into what God is calling me to do, it would be lack of confidence.
So in addition to that blind spot that reality that I had never understood before. Another kind of piece that you made me aware of was what you describe in your research as the courts. Help us understand that dynamic a little bit better.
Yeah. So what we did is we drew two courts, as if there were two basketball courts, to describe two different realities. Now, I, of course, want to be careful that I'm not saying all men are like this and all women are like this. Of course, we know that that's not true. But we are talking about statistically some differences in terms of what encourages women's confidence to grow and their willingness to use their voice and to move forward. And it does look a little bit different. It was my attempt to visualize some really important data around how do we actually create environments in which both men and women can thrive and learn and lead together. And one of the big pieces that we discovered for the women's court, so to speak, which is drawn like a box to represent, as I said, a basketball court or a board table or whatever metaphor you want to put there, is that there's this unusual pathway that most women take to get there. It's not a straight trajectory. And again, I don't want to suggest that all men's trajectory to leadership is a straight pathway either, but for women, there are a lot of convolutions along the way. It begins very early. You already mentioned about this idea of being beautiful or being smart. A lot of girls do think that. In fact, by age 6, some studies show that women think that they have to choose between either being beautiful or being having good character. That it would be rather be known as being beautiful than as having good character. By age 7, they have to choose between being smart or being likable to their friends. So it starts really early. These messages start really early. And then what's also very disturbing about this is that the more well-educated and the more well-traveled a woman is, the more likely she is to have a higher imposter syndrome, which makes no sense when you think about it through this court over here. But through the female court, it makes a whole lot of sense, because women have been socialized to believe that if they put their hand up in school, if they stand out in some way, they're going to have to be knocked down in order to kind of keep them in their place amongst their peers. And also that guys are not going to like them as much. And of course, this isn't always true, but statistically speaking, we see this pattern from a very young age. And so a lot of women have internalized these messages from a really young age. And as they are more well-educated and as they are more well-traveled, they're also aware of what's happening to women around the world. And that contributes to their sense of what's sometimes described as being other. And all that means is that a lot of women are experiencing high levels of anxiety around their work, high levels of challenges finding their voice and using their voice, and high levels of insecurity about stepping into things that really they're more than qualified.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about the courts is the way that in your design of them, the way men naturally default in their confidence to asserting themselves, both jumping at opportunities and asserting their perspective on things, whereas women needing to be invited in. Even just that feature of differentiation in the courts was game-changing for me, because what I was realizing was, as this young man who started in ministry with other young men, this cute little band of brothers, and I've told people, our first hires, we made 3 hires, 2 of them were women, and they weren't just for stereotypically female, administrative roles. They were for pastoral roles. Again, in my mind, I'd always seen men and women leading and flourishing together. But now you fast forward 10 or 15 years, and this cute little band of brothers has become this impenetrable boys club. And I always wondered, why haven't the women stepped up, right? Why haven't the women come to the party? And I guess the haunting awareness that I had to concede once I understood the courts, and I often refer to it as the difference between saltwater and freshwater fish, is that I had been expecting women to thrive and flourish in a man's world. I'd been expecting women to thrive in an unknowingly, exclusively male court. And for church leaders who are tracking with this, I hope that you can just kind of press pause and process those two realities, the differentiation in confidence and the trajectory split between confidence and insecurity, and the underlying courts that contribute to correcting that and realizing the vision of men and women thriving together. Because I feel like just those two things alone were absolutely game-changing in our context. I guess my final question, Ellen, as we kind of diagnosed sort of the high levels of this problem or the issue, can you talk about how the church, the Christian church specifically, kind of exacerbates these dynamics?
Yeah, well, this is one of the saddest pieces, I think. Regardless of your theology around this, and I understand that there are differences of opinion around this theologically, surely the church should be the place where people discover who they are and where they can thrive. And sadly, we know that for many women and girls, this is not true. In fact, I was involved in a research project a number of years ago that looked at women that moved from so-called market ministry into organizations and churches that were explicitly Christian. And their levels of confidence dropped significantly when they moved into those environments. That's quite worrisome when you think about it. And it's a combination of factors, very much like you said, saltwater, versus fresh water. But when a young girl sees only male voices, hears only male voices, or sees only male faces, in leadership or speaking from the front, that is going to, of course, impact her view of self and what's possible for her. And so there are significant things that we need to think about systemically, which I know we're going to jump into later on. But one of the most powerful ones is when we have 30% female representation at decision-making tables around the world, we not only see those women more likely to show up as themselves and actually be able to use their voice and to be heard, but also we see all kinds of community development things that move forward. So we see clean water and education, a number of things that the church, I think most parts of the world cares about, go up. And we see things like crime and terrorism and discrimination levels go down. And so this is true on a micro level within the local church, but it's also about the church and the impact of the church globally and how what we do on a micro level has a profound impact on the macro as well.
So for church leaders who are taking in this webinar today, I just want to be super clear. This is not about convincing people who hold complementarian views to embrace egalitarian theology, although I'm sure there is a theological layer to all of this. This is simply about realizing the fullness of God's potential in 50% of your faith community. And more importantly, from our perspective, experiencing the fullness of both the maternal and paternal aspects of the heart of God. That when God created men and women, Genesis says, he created people in his image. And so as a local church, we've been trying to experience in this vision of pursuing spiritual moms and spiritual dads, parenting the family together, we want to experience the fullness of the maternal aspects of the heart of God in addition to the paternal aspects. That's what we're talking about, okay? So we're clear, Ellen's clear, I hope you're clear too. Want to shift gears then, and I'm going to move into the second section of this conversation and start to get into what you would have advised us to do in responding to this struggle that this cute little band of brothers, whether we were cute or not, I suppose is debatable, but this cute little band of brothers becoming this impenetrable boys club. And we wanted to now realize the fullness of potential of the women among us. You started to consult us on this. Can you talk about some of the things that you advised us to do?
So one of the first conversations that we had, Jeff, you may recall, we talked about, would it be helpful to begin some things for women and girls? And the answer to that is, of course, yes. But that is a very small subset of what it takes to create culture change. And so one of the things that we did early on, you may recall, is we began to do some work with the senior leadership team and with the senior women in the organization, both volunteers and paid staff, And we really kind of approached it from a variety of different levels. And the idea behind that, you may even recall, I remember you saying to me, I wasn't expecting our first sessions to be like this. And we did something like an inner critic exercise or something like that. Because really what we were trying to do is we were trying to connect as humanity. We were trying to assess, we have so much in common. Let's meet in those places in common. And we were building trust. And then as we got to know each other a little bit deeper, we were able to dig into some of these topics, which can be controversial, and we can be defensive about those if we haven't established those bridges. You know, you don't take a big truck and drive it over a bridge that's not ready for it. And so I think that was one of the intentionalities behind the first thing we did. Then we did some research, and we found out from women who were working in the church, volunteering in the church, attending the church, as well as people who had left, women who had left, to try and find out what are the actual factors. Because listening is a huge part of this journey. You know, if there was a formulaic do ABC, we would all be doing it. It's not that simple. And so we were trying to find out what are the specific things that would make the biggest difference. And in response to that report, there were some interesting conversations. And I remember one of them in particular, and that was with the senior leadership team when I presented these findings. And there were 2 or 3 of the leaders who came and spoke to me on the side and said, I would be willing to give up my seat at the table if that's what it takes for us to create room so that we can truly reflect our values here. And I think it's that kind of mentality, that kind of openness, that kind of teachability, that kind of vulnerability that allows us to actually have these conversations. And of course, that has to be all the way around. You know, when a woman comes to her position of leadership, she just doesn't step in as if she hasn't had a life behind her, just like, of course, that's true for men as well. We all have like a train load of messages that we're bringing with us. And those, we have to create safe spaces to have those kinds of conversations. And then, of course, the other piece that we did was we created some really intentional developmental opportunities, which was next level leadership for women. And there have been a number of cohorts that have participated in that. And then the Brave Girls.
Yeah, we'll get into those in just a moment. I wanted to just respond to your first comment to church leaders who are participating in this webinar that, and I don't see this from my seat. I'm glad Ellen's bringing that perspective. But there does need to be I must decrease in order for Jesus and his way of life and the reality of the kingdom of God on earth in our context, as it is in heaven, to happen. Because if we're rigid and closed and just engaging in this conversation like it's theory, there's going to be no culture change. So I appreciate you saying that, Ellen. From my perspective, I feel like when we got those 2 pillars of the confidence trajectory difference and the differentiation of courts, the 2 different cultures in which men and women thrive, essentially we were trying to attack both of those dynamics. On the one hand, through some disproportionate investment into confidence and leadership development in girls and women. And then on the other hand, by disproportionate invitation of women and the female court into environments that had formerly been pretty much exclusively men's worlds. And so I want to talk first of all about the disproportionate investment. You use some language like next level leadership and Brave Girls. Talk about what those phrases mean.
Yeah, thank you. So Next Level Leadership is an international leadership development organization that began in 2000 when God brought together 5 women in a very unique divine appointment kind of way, and then literally showed us the vision from the outside in, where people kept asking for things that we didn't know that we were actually going to create. And part of that became a curriculum and a facilitator training process. And as I said, we now have facilitators in many parts of the world, and we have the curriculum available in French and English in Canada. And so that was a resource that I was already connected to and kind of knew about. And so it was an easy step to suggest that maybe some of the Southridge women would want to participate in that. And there were a group of women who went through it. and found it helpful, and then became trained as facilitators and are now doing all of that in-house. And there are cohorts that move through every 2 years. And I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's getting up there because we've been doing it for a number of years now, and there's been 20 or 30 women per cohort.
Yeah, in our context, practically, we began this with our 24 most senior or most influential, kind of what we call load-bearing wall female leaders. And we kind of identified those 24 or so and ran them through the first cohort. Like you said, it's a 2-year program of workshops and retreats and various things. We ran these 24 through the first cohort of next level leadership. Some of them became trainers. And every 2 years, we run another 24 through and then graduate them into an alumni cohort. So at this point, I believe our alumni cohort has 3 rounds, so 6 different years of 2-year investments in 24 or so of our most load-bearing wall female leaders in our community. So if church leaders are tracking with this conversation, wondering, okay, how did you leverage next level leadership at a practical level? That's what we did. On top of that, then, together in partnership with you, we created this experience called Brave Girls. What is that?
Mm-hmm. So, all the research shows that grades 6 to 8, girls who are in grades 6 to 8, that's a really critical window for their development of their sense of identity and their development of their sense of agency, their ability to influence things around them, their belief in their own ability to lead, essentially. And so we targeted that age group, and we took the research and we created a program called BRAVE, which is an acronym, and it really kind of flips on its head some of the myths that a lot of girls have been socialized to believe. And it's things like, I have to be beautiful in order to be loved. Well, we know that that's not true, that we are the beloved, and that's what makes us beautiful. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I often say, people who have pug dogs, I'm not a huge pug dog lover. I think they're cute from a distance, but up close, they're not my favorite. But people who love them and, think they're beautiful. Well, that just proves to you, that when you love something, it is beautiful to you. And in the same way, it is not our external beauty that makes us beloved by God or even by other people. And so it takes some of those things and flips them on their head. So it looks at boldness and beauty and what it means to live a balanced life. That's the B of brave. And then resilience and advocacy and action is like the point of the arrow, about why we're doing this, so that we can now learn to use our voice and have an expanded influence as we have expanded perspective. And so BRAVE is a multi-year program, and it's similarly to Next Level. There are girls who go through it in a cohort type of experience. They sign up for 3 years. Not all of them, of course, complete all 3 years, but many of them do. And then when they graduate from that, they move into an alumni program that's amazing as well, because it keeps them connected through their high school years, which is another very critical window for young women. And then, of course, another critical window as they transition from high school to university. And so now they have mentors and friends that they're making that transition with.
Again, for church leaders who are engaging in this conversation at a practical level, what we've done is invited any regular attending girl, kind of in grade 5, to participate in this program. Brave Girls was not exclusive, but it wasn't also open to all kinds of people from other churches. Okay, it was for regular church participants here at Southridge, according to whatever that definition was. And in each different year, they were part of their own cohort. That's important to understand, that you're kind of viewed as year 1, then year 2, then year 3, then alumni. And each of those cohorts has its own leadership group of next level leader graduates. So there's a bridge even between the two programs. And so a grade 6 girl enters in as year 1, and then each year graduates from year 1 to 2 to 3, and then to alumni. Just last week, we participated together in the year 3 graduation that just happened, that my daughter was part of because she's now in high school. And so Ellen and I played roles in that, and that was kind of cool to celebrate together. But just so at a practical level, we understand the logistics of how this works. Now we've got these two programs in play. We've actually just celebrated the 10-year anniversary of Brave. So we've done 10 years of Brave. And I don't know how many cohorts that would be. 7 cohorts, I guess, if it's 3 years, right? 7 cohorts of year 1, 2, and 3 Brave Girls, which has really been quite remarkable. In addition, when we talk about the cohorts and the disproportionate invitation, and you talk about representation and things like that, can you just speak more to those dynamics of what we had to do to change the nature of how meetings happened, how we elicited and leveraged the voice of females around the table, and what it took to get our board of elders, our senior leadership team, and other ministries to have those, I don't want to use the word like rep by pop or, affirmative action kind of language, but what it took to get those tables representative enough that women could thrive.
Yeah, thank you. So I would say a couple of things. From the research generally, we know that some things that we have tried in the past don't work. So, having assertiveness training for women, or having gender sensitivity training for men and women, or having quotas that are artificially enforced, or any number of those types of things don't actually help, because what we're talking about is we're talking about a culture change that enables us to have people who genuinely try to understand each other and get to know each other. And so what we were trying to do here is we were trying to figure out how can we actually move towards these inclusive courts, and what would that look like? So what that meant for us as we began to work together was that we thought about what is it actually going to take so that we have representation of men and women, so that from a young age, this is what boys and girls are growing up seeing. They're seeing men and women at the table. They're seeing men and women on the stage. And although I am not a proponent of quotas per se, and I know that a lot of people have some concerns about that, there is something to be said about this minimum of 30% women. And so we set some goals, some things to work towards. We didn't initiate them right away or artificially or in a way that would be unhelpful, but we did work towards some things. And I think in many cases, we've exceeded many of those goals in terms of female representation, female opportunities for development, as well as conversations around how to actually make this work. So it's not just something that is artificially imposed on people, but rather it opens up the opportunity for some deep conversation. And as I said, that's the piece that we often stop before we get to. We stop at the, here's 3 things we should do, but then we don't have the actual trusting, vulnerable conversations about, okay, now that we're here at the table, how can we work well together? What does that look like? And that's the piece that was so important in this process.
Ellen, I want to ask a dangerous question, and I'll concede again, kind of where I started this conversation, conceding that this was one of my greatest leadership failures. But I know that there are other church leaders who are probably thinking this, so I'm going to ask it because I've thought it too, in the eras where I was failing the most, probably. If I'm part of a more male-dominated leadership environment and I'm inspired to this men and women flourishing together, but I don't feel like I have women at the level or capable of leading at the level or preaching at the level or contributing at the level that would legitimately, respectfully include them in those environments. What do I do?
Yeah, such a great question, Jeff, and really, really important, I think, for us to be sensitive around this, because what often happens is with the best of intentions, we say, oh yeah, well, let's, get Susie to step in and have her preach this Sunday without really giving her adequate preparation. And then when she feels unsuccessful and when others feel that it wasn't very successful, then we could look back to that and go, well, we tried that, but it didn't really work. And unfortunately, that happens quite commonly with the very best of intentions. And so really it's about 2 things, I would say. One is identification of leaders. I remember one time I was asked to consult for this leadership group that had, I think there were 10 or 12 emerging leaders around the table that had just gone through a fairly significant training opportunity. I think it was 6 months or 9 months long. And at the end, when I was brought back in, I was chatting with one of the leaders of it and asking him, what do you see? Tell me about some of the people around the room. Where do you see them going? And he identified 3 or 4 of the guys and said, these guys are amazing and they're going to really step into these various roles, and I can see them being very successful. And so I listened, and then I said, okay, so tell me about some of the women. And he said, well, I don't know that these women are really leader caliber. And I said, can you help me to understand what you mean by that? And the way he described what he was looking for was a very male model of leadership. And it was things like, in a conversation, they listen before they speak. And I said, surely we want leaders who listen before they speak. And he said, yeah, but leaders, like they're quick on their feet and they jump in and they have an opinion and whatever. And this is one of the big differences for men and women around a table. And not only that, but actually we've all been socialized to kind of read things through our own little lens. So we know that if we are at a table and the opposite happens, if women do speak up more than somewhere around 17 to 24% of the time, then if you were to poll some of the guys as they were leaving, many of them would say that the women spoke disproportionately more than the men did, even though it's less than 1/4. We don't know the exact reasons for this, but there's some speculation that perhaps it's because of what we see on the media and movies, those types of things, where generally speaking, women have speaking parts 11 to 17% of the time. So anything more than that seems disproportionate. And so you can see how women sometimes get caught in this double bind, where it's like, if I speak up, I'm going to get, misrepresented for that, for being bossy or whatever, if I don't speak up. And so part of it is about being able to identify what a female leader looks like and some of the messages that she's carrying with her as she's moving forward. That's a huge piece in helping women. And then I think the other piece is in, as I mentioned, the development of women, which Southridge has been very intentional about. So if someone hasn't been given opportunities to do this little thing and this little bit bigger thing and this little bit bigger thing, and if they hadn't had coaching and if they haven't had training as they moved along, then of course we're not going to ask them to jump from here to here, but that's often what happens for women as well. So I think it's a combination of just maybe the women leaders in your circle are there, they just don't look like what you were expecting or whatever, and maybe they haven't had the same level of opportunities that some of the guys have. And then, of course, maybe confidence is a factor for them.
You're saying some mind-blowing things. So I just want to pause and react at a practical level to some of the ways that those affected us. I would say at one level, we had to realize that next level leadership and generic confidence building was not the sum total of skill or gift development required to fully empower female leaders. Specifically, public speaking, preaching, biblical interpretation, difficult conversations, conflict resolution, some of those things that dads do in the spiritual family that we needed moms to do. Simply speaking into their confidence was not translating into them being able to do. And we realized that, okay, we need confidence development and we need gift development. That was a huge learning for us along the way. The other one was really learning to affirm, I would say, more in the women than in the expectation of the guys, for them to deliver God's and the Holy Spirit's fullest weight of investment through them, meaning to be themselves. One of the real hiccups that we found for a number of years in trying to engage female preachers was that every one of the female preachers because they were being developed by myself and especially our teaching pastor, Mike Krause, who has been part of this staff as long as I have. He's been teaching the Bible here for almost a quarter century and is doing like PhD level training on theology and Bible teaching. Like as he was investing in developing them, they would give these talks that felt like women were trying to be Mike Krause. And Mike didn't want that. I didn't want that, but it was just sort of assumed in them. And we had to really do things differently to try to say, no, remember, this is about capturing the maternal heart of God, not just the paternal heart of God. And we need God's truth poured through your personality, through your heart, through your values, through your experiences, and through your gender. And so the skill development, and then on top of that, the skill development specifically through the female lens was, and I'll say is, kind of the real-time challenges that we're facing to try to get that representation in some of those key spiritual parental roles. Can you react to that or comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, this is a very common situation. So of course, we tend to mimic those that we admire. And so it's common for us generally, men and women, we both do this. We tend to mimic those that we admire, and we tend to mimic what we think is expected. And so for women growing up, hearing primarily male preaching, male teaching, whatever those pieces might be for them, they will almost subconsciously begin to internalize that. And especially if they're being, of course, coached by or mentored by someone that they both respect and admire and who is successful in that culture. Because every organization has its own style of leadership, its own style of using its voice. And so we try to almost like internalize that so that we can replicate that. And some of that is conscious and some of it is unconscious. So the piece that you're talking about is a really important piece because it is about how do we find our female voice and voices. And that is a huge journey for a lot of women. In fact, many women spend a good part of their lives trying to find their voice, because our voice is not just about our speaking voice and the words that we say. It is about our character, our credibility, our lived experience. It is that like kind of lion in your belly, that roar that comes out about the things that you are passionate about. And that when we help women to discover their voice, there's a close alignment between discovering their inner voice and their ability to use their external voice. But there is a journey to that. And for many people, they haven't had the opportunity to develop that. So there's the actual public speaking kind of training, but then there's also the inner work that needs to happen in terms of developing their own female voice.
Ellen, I want to sort of shift gears into this third section then, and because we're starting to talk about where we're at real time right now as a local church. Over this last decade or so, just not just as a consultant, but as an outside observer to our local church, what have you seen as far as the results or the impacts of this kind of disproportionate investment and disproportionate invitation of female leaders?
Talk about the Brave Girls, first of all, because that's a place that's near and dear to both your heart and mine, I know. One of the ways that the Brave Girls program works is that we have retreats. And so I would often meet the girls when they were just starting into the program. They're in grade 6. They're new to each other. They're new to the program. They come away on a retreat to a strange place. And I was able to observe their behavior. But then fast forward 3 years, seeing those same exact girls standing up at grad, talking to hundreds of people and seeing the way that they have developed and the way that they have flourished as a result of their time. I mean, if we only did that, Jeff, that would have been absolutely worthwhile, wouldn't it? But that's just one small piece of the puzzle. Then we talk about the Next Level initiative and the number of women who have developed both competencies and confidence as a result of that. So that's another piece of the puzzle. But then there's also the way that the leadership team has transformed. It now has broad representation of men and women and talks openly and honestly about both the opportunities and the challenges that that provides. And that's true at an elders level. That's true at those that you hear on the stage level. And it's as we begin to see all of these various pieces fit together, that's when we begin to see change. I remember, Jeff, in the early days, we did one event that was for men only. And we opened it up and invited anyone who wanted to come. And we expected maybe about 30 people. And I think there were about 120 guys that showed up. And I remember they came in and they stood, and it was kind of crowded because we weren't expecting such a large crowd. And one of the guys said to me, we're kind of intimidated to be here. And here it was, me, one against 120. I was like, you're intimidated. How do you think I feel? But we ended up having this amazing conversation. And the reason that I point to that night and that was so significant to me is that a lot of those people were there as fathers or uncles or grandfathers or neighbors. And they were there because they cared about their spouse, they cared about their daughter, they cared about their niece. And so when this becomes personal like that, it's about creating inclusive environments. Yes, it's about reflecting the heart of God. That's incredibly important. But it's also about our ability to relate. And I think there has been a huge change. That's certainly what I saw from that night forward in how people are thinking about the impact of this on young boys and girls and the way that they're growing up.
Yeah, I would say this has been as effectual on men and boys as it has been women and girls, right? And that's important for a church leader tracking with us today to understand. This isn't just a segmented departmental initiative. This is a community-wide cultural transformational movement where all of us are being grown together into the image of God. With a few more minutes left, there's a couple other things that I want to tap into. One is just to get your comments on, I'll say, the Me Too and the Church Too dynamics, because that's kind of emerged concurrently while we've been on this journey as a church. And we've been trying to promote women and female leaders. How does that effort, how does that focus also help a church protect women in the ways that we're seeing violated really all over the place in the church, at least across North America?
Yeah. Well, these stories are heartbreaking, aren't they? And it's heartbreaking that within the church, so much of this has been going on. And I think when we address this in terms of how do we create environments in which men and women can thrive, we are doing both protective work and preventative work. And that's why this is so incredibly important. Whenever someone or something has been pushed down, like a beach ball under the water, push down, it is going to come popping back up. And stuff does come up to kind of bite us in the back. And unfortunately, there have been abuses in the past. But when we do this kind of work, not only are there more likely not to be abuses because we are seeking to live and work together as brothers and sisters in the church, but secondly, if and when something were to come up, we have a much better foundation of trust. We have a much better understanding of each other and how to communicate in a way to deal with any things that come up as an anomaly within a large organization or church. Of course, there are occasionally going to be things that happen which are incredibly unfortunate.
Yeah, you talk about the fact that in communities, there are things that happen at times. One of the things, though, that I've observed, because of, in part, I would say, the confidence investments, is the willingness or eagerness to kind of report or to even bring up issues where I think what spirals this downward, or at least what contributes to the downward spiral, isn't just that terrible things happen from time to time, but because of that default to insecurity and because of that total absence of representation in power positions, the voice gets even quieter and the cycle goes down and down and down it goes. Some of what the investment in promoting into women can do is help intervene on the protective side as well, is what I've experienced. You track with that?
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely true. People sometimes say when something happens in a church, why didn't some of the women speak up? I ask, yeah, what were the factors that would make it hard for them to have spoken up? And so this is a kind of conversation that not only provides safety nets and training and deep relationships, but it also, as you said, enables women to come forward when something happens in a way that they are not expecting that there will be retaliation for coming forward.
Final thing I want to tap into and just get your comment on, and I know you and I have talked recently about this at length, is that if there is underlying theology behind a movement like this being effective in a local community, at some level, it has less to do with the theology of complementarian or egalitarian views on the role of women in leadership. It actually has more to do, in some levels, with your underlying understanding of the gospel and the invitation of Jesus. That the way of Jesus that he invites us into is actually an increasing relinquishment of privilege for those of less privilege in a way that increasingly comforts those who are afflicted around us intentionally to the affliction of those of us who are comfortable. I say that because I see all over the place, even in our context, that much of the Western church has been built around serving the stresses and struggles of us privileged people, and the goal of the church or the goal of spiritual life being making me comfortable, not taking me out of my comfort zone, and especially using my power for the powerless. Can you talk about how that way of Jesus ultimately undergirds all of this, not just when it comes to empowering women, but all kinds of broader values of inclusion, empowerment, justice, and equality that are core to the heart of God?
Yeah, well, we've just got to the really important part of this conversation, haven't we? This is ultimately what it's about. It's about our view of who God is, our view of why Jesus came, and our view of our calling now in light of the fact that Jesus came for us. And exactly like you said, we have pride and issues of power that we are completely unaware of often, and we don't even realize how they are playing into these kinds of conversations. But the way of Jesus, or what we describe as the brave way, we don't have to go this way or that way. We can choose the brave way, the Jesus way. The Jesus way is to see the one who is excluded and to make room for them at the table and to adjust my behavior so that they feel comfortable. The Jesus way is to go out of my way to gather those who don't have a place where their voice can be included. The Jesus way is to reconcile and to wrestle and to become brothers and sisters in genuine, authentic, and vulnerable ways. And so this is why this topic is incredibly important, because it is a representation of what we believe about God and what we believe the gospel includes and invites us into.
I hope church leaders who are taking this in and even processing this as leadership teams understand that there is a deeper conversation to have. This is not just about strategy in how to make disproportionate investments in senior leader women or developmental aged girls. This is about how you understand the way of Jesus and how you operationalize this in certain ways in your community. So I just want to be clear on that. Ellen, as we wrap things up, I want to give you the final shot. Any other challenges or encouragements or inspirations to the leaders who want to grow in this way, even if they don't yet acknowledge that this is a failure in their community, like it certainly was in ours?
Yeah. So I would like to speak to the issue of fear, because when we talk about these kinds of things, there will be some fear that sometimes emerges or some defensiveness. And I think when we talk about how do we create environments in which both men and women can thrive, where we can more truly reflect the heart of God and the gospel of Jesus, that is going to elicit some, oh yeah, but if I do that, that's going to open that can of worms, or so-and-so is not going to be happy, or, any number of fears. But I guess I would just encourage us to consider what fear are we going to allow to drive us? Are we going to allow those kinds of fears to drive our behavior? Or is our fear going to be that we haven't aligned ourselves closely enough with the heart of God? And I think when I put it in that way for myself, that really reframes and kind of prioritizes some of the other things that I might be concerned about.
Fantastic, Ellen. Thank you so much for being with us today. For all of you who are tracking with us, I hope that you can understand why Ellen has become an affiliate of our Leaders Village. And if you want to go to our website under our consultants, you can tap into Ellen and try to leverage her to a greater degree. I would highly encourage that in your local church context. As well, I hope that you'll join us next month for another webinar. We're going to talk about the importance of governance and the unique role that governance plays in the life of our church. But in the meantime, track with us online at leadersvillage.ca. Join us on social at Leaders Village on any of our social media handles, and continue in this journey and adventure of finding our way together as we pursue and facilitate for people and operationalize the way of Jesus among us as local communities, church ministry leaders all across the country and beyond. So thanks for joining us today. We're looking forward to seeing you in a month. Take care, everybody.